After a 7-hour hearing and months of community input, developers at HYM got a critical first approval for transformation of the former Suffolk Downs racetrack. Straddling East Boston and Revere, the property could eventually have 10,000 units of housing, along with office space and parkland. A central question for many in East Boston is whether the city's conditions for development provide enough relief from a tight housing market and from other kinds of fallout connected with new growth. To help with the answer is the area's district city councilor, Lydia Edwards. Thank you very much for being with us, Councilor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Councilor, as you noted in your posts immediately after the hearing, there were a number of gains for the community at the end of the process so far, at least. But on the other hand, at the hearing, there were people there from the neighborhood who were still very disappointed. So how do you square those two?
Well, I think it's a balance of interests. We can hold both narratives. We can say at one time, we're happy with some of the things that we got, but at the same time, we still can feel that we deserve more. And that as East Boston is just part of our spirit, our activist heart, we deal with big institutions. And the way to deal with them is to constantly say, we need more and we're going to keep fighting for more. And I think that's a perfectly fine thing for any neighborhood that's going to deal with massive development such as this, to hold both narratives. It's good, but it's still not good enough. And we're still going to continue to demand more.
Well, it's one thing to make demands for the community. It's another thing to have leverage here. And what about the leverage in this case? A huge amount of land, but what about how the process defines its leverage?
Sure. This is a private development, which is definitely changes the leverage points that we have, because on city land, you can certainly push for more just by right. It's public land, it's a public resource, but it's private. You have to build in enough hooks and accountability measures in the actual plan. So we have building by building approvals by the community group. We have phased check-ins. We also have the developer coming back and seeking us additional votes to continue the project at 60% and 80%. So there are certain check-ins with that. We also have the developer being required to adhere to the new zoning code for affirmatively furthering for housing, which demands equity analysis at each one of these checkpoints. Lucky for us, we're still writing it. So there's certain checkpoints that we may have not gotten in the PDA, but that we could put in the zoning code that we're still going to finish, and the Walsh administration is committed to actually completing this year. And in terms of the process, I mean, that I think having gone through it for now, it's almost 2 years. I would like to, push on the city to come up with a process that isn't responding to developers' ideal zoning and instead is setting it for them and saying, this is how you approach something in the future. I think the process is flawed in as much as the city responds to the developer and we as a community try to mitigate as much from the developer, but it's still centered on his profits, or the developer's, his or her profits, and his or her ideal zoning.
And actually, it sounds to me as if the way things worked out here, and which is not so unusual, is that the parameters were defined by the market as opposed to the city saying, well, let's define things differently.
By the market and by the developer. And so, and again, I push on the city. The developer is going to do what he has to do for his investors. So he's doing his job. And I want the city to push more, to demand more outright. These are minimums that you can even approach us with. And I think we had some, but they definitely need to be revamped. But I just think when you have this opportunity of massive amounts of development near a neighborhood, in any neighborhood around the Commonwealth, your city planners should be planning what the ideal is for that moment.
Well, under the parameters approved by the city here, you have 13% of the units that would be income restricted, even though that could mean households with incomes well above the median for East Boston. So what about helping people who are closer to the neighborhood median and maybe some of the new gains in this decision?
So across the entire affordable units, which include on-site and off-site, we went from 13 to 20%. And we did lower the AMIs, though not low enough. That's the average medium incomes. And so what does that mean? That's again where the checkpoints come in. Every single time the developer comes in for an amendment is an opportunity for the city and the community to negotiate for more, for deeper affordability, and for also deeper or more units for family sizes. But by the way, we went from 26% of the units to about 40% of the units across the board, again, being for families. Now, that being said, we did get $5 million stabilization fund, just for East Boston to help with people right now. I agree. And though we cannot predict necessarily in 20 years what the average size of East Boston will be, but a lot of what the gains and the minimums that we have are about 20 years from now. I have folks who in 20 days can't pay rent. So that's why I was happy to happy to push for and got the rent relief fund, additional $400,000 just last week. And then on top of that, another $400,000 from the city. And on top of that, per building that goes up, another average about $600,000 total, but on each building, $10,000 to $20,000 that goes up. So while again, there are certainly gaps still remaining, we're talking about minimums. And the funds that we have right now to stabilize just East Boston, I believe to this day, we're the only neighborhood that has a stabilization fund that'll be run by the community.
What about jobs?
Jobs, I'm honestly, there was already very clear we were going to get 14,000 construction jobs and 25,000 about permanent jobs on the site. But what made sense for right now was the pipelines that we create in East Boston to make sure people are able to take those jobs. So $1 million have gone to ELL training and job preparation for East Boston residents. That's English language learning for those folks who don't know. Another $1 million has gone to expand building pathways, which is a wonderful program. Started to make sure that folks who either who are returning citizens or people who of color or women are given a pre-apprentice opportunity to kind of get them ready to go and be pipelined into unions. And that $1 million will expand the seats for East Boston residents. And so between the two, it's making sure that we have access to those great paying jobs because we fought for and successfully received a PLA, or project labor agreement. All the jobs, all the construction jobs will be union.
There were some environmental concerns around this development as well, and one of them concerned Belle Isle Marsh, which is already vulnerable to climate change. How does this decision by the city affect that?
Again, with the minimums, we got the developer to pay for an additional park ranger. And really, honestly, it's making sure that people who come in and move near Belle Isle Marsh do not treat it as a big dog park. Dogs are not allowed in Belle Isle Marsh. I'll just repeat that. Dogs are not allowed in Belle Isle Marsh. It is a place for coyotes and wild animals to feel free to roam. It is a place, it's a conservation place. And so we needed to, and they fought for the Friends of Belle Isle Marsh for a study to be implemented, a visitor impact study. And those recommendations, the developer has agreed to work with the city and the state and his own private investors to implement those recommendations from the study to make sure that the Belle Isle Marsh is preserved as much as possible.
East Boston has some nice waterfront areas open to the public, but parkland, maybe the not so well endowed, people were concerned this development was going to turn into a gated community, so off limits even to people taking a walk. You put in some provisions, or at least the city put in some provisions here to make sure that doesn't happen, right?
We fought for provisions to assure that people have the right to freedom of speech and to make sure that they have the right to assembly regardless of who owns the land. When it was all privately owned, you did not have those rights. And my first thoughts were about Trayvon Martin. My first thoughts were about private security forces, and I didn't want that. And so the developer also did not want that, to his credit, and worked with the city to deed a lot of the public spaces to the city to own, while he and I think a group of owners will be maintaining them. And that was a better, so your rights are attached to who owns it, and that's now government property. And also assuring that the private owners and private publicly accessible land also adhere to minimums of constitutional rights.
Of course, another thing that we've been hearing for quite a while is that people don't want to see this be another Seaport district, at least in terms of the layout and the sense of how people can get access to the public areas. Do you see this being much different?
Right now, I do see at the very fundamental, with certain protections put in, being much different. We also, unlike the Seaport, have a very active community that's going to hold the developer accountable. You have to understand the Seaport on paper looked pretty good. It was through the amendment process over years that they were able to take away green space, that they were able to just reduce, and make it what a lot of people criticize as a neighborhood that's really only for extremely wealthy people. It does not reflect our ethnic and racial diversity of Boston, and isn't even really publicly accessible in terms of transportation. But that's through amendment process, and it's our job as the community to hold the line and expand the opportunities going forward. Also, there was no equity amendment at the time when the Seaport passed, and it's never been applied. Equity analysis has never been applied to the Seaport.
You've been trying to change, or I should say, strengthen the city's guidelines and enforcement around fair housing. This
Mhm.
project, I understand, will be subject to that. What difference will that make exactly?
The difference is that we will be now have legal obligations. He has legal obligations to affirmatively further fair housing and to make sure that equity is part of all of his designs and analysis going forward. And we will be looking at the standards that we're setting right now for integrated neighborhoods where people have reasonable access to public transportation, to education, to jobs. And it'll be his job, his requirement, legal requirement, excuse me, to meet those standards that the city is writing right now.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us and to explain all that.
Thank
Boston,
you. Thank you so much.
Boston City Councilor Lydia Edwards. We'll have more news in just a moment.